Some people are the actual worst. And I don't mean that neighbor of yours who throws banana skins at your house, or the mean girl at school who said your outfit was rubbish, although those people definitely suck. No, these are the very worst people in all of history. We've gathered together the nastiest, most evil, creatively violent, and murderous individuals of all time.
No, you don't need to talk to me.
And put them into one extra horrible video just for you. You lucky people. Try not to have nightmares. From a mad monk who just refused to lay down and die already, to a serial killer who ate his victims because meat was simply too pricey for his budget, here are 20 of the scariest people of all time. Number 20. Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin is one of the most mysterious and bizarre figures in history. He was a Russian peasant who became a trusted advisor to Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra. But it was his death that really solidified this guy in the history books of weirdness. He left his ordinary life as a peasant to become a monk in 1897. He visited various towns and churches, ultimately joining a sect within the Russian Orthodox Church. This group were known as the Klists, and they believed that it was only by committing as much sin as possible and then repenting that one could become close to God. So they spent an awful lot of time indulging in so-called sins. Rasputin then went off to spread his holy stuff around, declaring himself to be a holy man who had supernatural abilities. It turns out that his supernatural abilities were less likely to be healing powers, as he claimed, and were actually just a certain amount of ability in hypnosis. After the revolution of 1905, he then became involved in the Russian royal family, and they believed that his skills helped to control the medical condition of their young son Alexei. Rasputin was kind of disgusting though, and he rarely ever washed, but people seem to overlook this on the account of his mysterious nonsense. And somehow, he was also famous for seducing noble women. Anyways, in the end, he was assassinated, but it took several goes before he would actually die, thus adding to the mythology surrounding the so-called mad monk. He was stabbed, poisoned with an enormous amount of cyanide, and then he was shot repeatedly, but none of this actually did him in. It was only when he was finally thrown into the river that he eventually drowned. Before we go on, like this video, smash the subscribe button, and click the notification bell right now, or this centipede will crawl on your face when you're sleeping. Number 19. Elizabeth Bathory. Back in the 17th century, there was a Hungarian countess who is believed to have been one of the most terrible serial killers of all time. She was a wealthy and powerful noblewoman who lived in Hungary from 1560 until her death in 1614. During her lifetime, she's believed to have brutally more than 600 people. She used hideous and creative methods to torture and kill her victims, and is accused of covering them with honey and then leaving them outside for the insects to eat. She's known to have pushed needles into the fingers of young girls and cut their noses and lips, and she would whip victims with stinging nettles. Most famously, though, she's believed to have had a taste for blood. Some of the stories include Bathory bathing in the blood of her victims as an attempt to find the fountain of eternal youth. She was eventually apprehended for her crimes in 1610 and then was isolated in the family castle until she died. Number 18. Timur Dynasty. Timur was a Turco-Mongol ruler, and he was the last of the great nomadic conquerors from the Eurasian steppe region. He was an especially prolific and bloodthirsty conqueror who is credited with an unconscionably high number of deaths under his command. He's believed to have conquered more than any other person except for Alexander the Great, and with all that conquering came enormous death and destruction naturally. The campaigns of Timur caused the deaths of an estimated 17 million people, which during that period was an astonishing 5% of the total world's population. Imagine being responsible for 5 in every 100 people on Earth. That's how this guy made it onto this list of scariest people of all time. Number 17. Ilse Cook. One of the innumerable atrocities committed during the Holocaust is that it's difficult to single out individuals who were somehow notable for being worse than all of the others who were committing crimes against humanity with such a casual workday attitude. But apparently she was an especially evil individual. Known as the Witch of Buchenwald, she was the wife of the commandant of that notorious concentration camp, and she was infamous for her own brand of evil. She had a reputation as a sadist and was known for beating prisoners with a riding crop and then forcing them to perform acts for her amusement. She carried on with life after the end of the Second World War, but would be arrested in 1947 and held accountable for her actions during the conflict. She was ultimately charged with many crimes, which included having the tattooed skin of prisoners made into artifacts and forcing other prisoners to make these items for her. She was then released in 1949, but arrested the same day for the abuse of prisoners during her time at the concentration camp. She would be convicted and then sentenced to life in prison. She killed herself in 1967. Number 16. Vlad III. Vlad the Impaler was a Romanian prince, also known as Vlad Tepes, who was born in Transylvania in 1431. He's widely believed to be the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. Vlad the Impaler was famous, or rather infamous, in his own time for his cruel and unusual punishment of his enemies. He had a particularly perverse enjoyment for impaling his enemies on stakes in the ground and then leaving them to die in agony, hence the Impaler part of his name. He was known for exacting this torture on all of his enemies, both foreign and domestic. Even as he retreated from the battlefield, he would leave behind thousands of impaled victims as a so-called deterrent to the Ottoman forces that were advancing behind. This was a unique kind of brutality in a time period when brutality in general was pretty widespread and rarely that notable. So this guy must have made quite an impression to have lasted through time and continue to be remembered as one of the worst people in history. He must have single-handedly created an enormously productive steak-making industry as well. Number 15. Tsutomu Miyazaki. There is a massive problem with telling you all about the worst serial killers of all time. That's a good deal of what they want, you know. They want to be famous and for people to know what they've done. So, by perpetuating these stories and continuing to name them and perverts they are, achieving the fame or infamy that they so desired. It is sick, and we should think twice before we keep on doing it. But I only work here, and I have to do what I'm told. You're watching this video, so maybe this is the sort of horror that you want to hear about. Who can say? Anyways, this disgusting excuse for a human being was a Japanese serial who abducted and little girls in a quiet Japanese suburb. He then did horrific things with their bodies and tortured their grieving families with them, and he deserves no place in the history books and is a completely despicable animal. Number 14. Tomás de Torquemada. The Spanish Inquisition was a judicial procedure, and then later on it became an institution which was created by the Catholic Church to allegedly combat heresy. It used cruel and unusual punishments and torture, mainly on the account of some of the inquisitors who were running things. One such inquisitor was a guy by the name of Tomás de Torquemada. He was especially hostile towards Jews, and his punishments were doled out in great number to the Jewish people in particular. But as time went on, he extended the remit of so-called crimes to include not only heresy, but also sorcery, polygamy, blasphemy, sodomy, usury, and other offenses that all probably ended in E. However, most of which were extracted as confessions by the use of heinous torture, and then the guilty party would be burned at the stake. Under the rule of Torquemada, an estimated 2,000 victims were burned at the stake alone. Number 13. H.H. Holmes. So this guy, H.H. Holmes, was a really bad man. In fact, he was a prolific serial so, you know, one of the worst people in the world. In the late 19th century, H.H. Holmes was all the time up to no good. He was known to be a swindler, a bigamist, and an all-around unpleasant individual, as well as all that murdering that seems to have been doing. He moved to Illinois and bought a plot of land upon which he had built a 2-story mixed-use building, which had a combination of apartments and retail spaces. He never paid a penny toward the cost of this building, and the contractor sued him, but somehow the work continued. The people in the neighborhood began calling the building the Castle. When it was finished in 1891, Holmes then placed ads in papers for jobs and lodging for young women, and he also advertised that he was looking for a wife. Many of the employees then began to disappear. He added a third floor to the building, and in 1893, the Chicago World's Fair brought visitors into the city. Holmes opened up this building as a hotel, and many of his guests were never seen again. Most would be traced to the castle where the trail had stopped, and he went on to commit many more crimes, eventually being placed in jail. That's when the extent of the weirdness in the castle was revealed. The second floor of the building was an elaborate and horrifying maze where there were secret passageways, trap doors, false partitions, doors that led to nowhere, and 35 windowless rooms, and a whole scheme of dumbwaiters to assist him in moving the bodies of his victims to the basement. This was a genuine house of horrors with a crematorium, dissection table, vats of acid, torture devices, and countless other awful evidences of his crime. It became known as the Murder Castle, of course, and Holmes would be sentenced to death. The building was gutted by fire in mysterious circumstances in 1895 and then continued to be in use until 1938 when it was finally torn down. Number 12. Pedro Lopez. An evil and twisted serial killer and child raper, Pedro Alonso Lopez is one of the worst people to ever have lived in history, and we should probably spend as little time as possible discussing his disgusting self. Lopez is known to have at least 110 young girls between 1969 and 1980, although he claimed to have killed much more than 300. He took his victims from across Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. Terrifyingly, he was released from a mental facility in 1998, and nobody knows where he currently is. Number 11. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez went by many names over the course of his reign of terror in California. These were to include the Valley Intruder, the Walking, but most famously, and perhaps infamously, he would be dubbed with the most ominous name of the Night Stalker. Ramirez went about his crime spree for just over a year in Southern California, where from June of 1984 to August of 1985, he would engage in heinous acts that included everything from taking advantage of women without their consent to cold-blooded and ruthless homicide. Ramirez originally resided in the state of Texas, where he had gained a strong affection for Satanism and the occult, and at the age of 22 would transplant himself into the heart of the Valley and the greater Los Angeles area, and then eventually to the San Francisco Bay. It would be there in California that his deep and egregious depravity would come into full swing. Eventually, like all of these sick and twisted, Ramirez would be captured in a Benny Hill-esque kind of way that looked more like it should have been in a Buster Keaton silent film than in an episode of Law & Order. Ramirez had been identified and became headline news, and after being recognized the morning after returning from a bus trip to see his brother, he would panic upon being identified. That's when Ramirez ran across the freeway, tried to carjack several people, and ultimately ended up being beat about the head with a fence post before an angry mob of residents chased him down gang style and finally put an end to everyone's nightmare. It would be on September 20th of 1989 that Ramirez was convicted for all charges for which he would stand trial. That included 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. His trial cost $1.8 million, and up until the O.J. Simpson trial would hold the record for the most expensive court proceedings ever. Number 10. Jack the Ripper. One of the most famous and pervertedly revered serial killers of all time, Jack the Ripper has been given way too much limelight and significantly too many television, film, and book adaptations. This level of infamy and mystery does detract somewhat from the fact that this person was an evil sadist who ended women's lives in the most horrific of ways. But that's what we're talking about here. A who did disgusting things to innocent victims. Why are we so obsessed with this story is really the mystery. The so-called Jack the Ripper would take place in 1888 in the East End of London, England. There was an era in which the salacious details of and criminal activity were popularized by the press, and cheap printed stories that riled up the general public and whipped up a frenzy around these. He 5 women in total and mutilated their body. He then seemed to disappear, and the crimes would simply remain unsolved. Even to this day, there is an interest in the cases. New theories do surface every so often, suggesting who may have been responsible and why they ceased to commit any further crime. Number 9. Albert Fish. Born in 1870, Albert Fish was one of the most horrifying murders of the 19th century. He terrorized America and unknown numbers of children, although he actually only was convicted of killing one. It's believed that the criminally insane Albert Fish was responsible for murdering more than 100, and he also had perversions for mutilation and cannibalism, both of which seems to have indulged in quite frequently during his reign of terror. He was tried for the murder of one girl and then executed via the electric chair. Number 8. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was a man who had a great knowledge of many things, and he used that knowledge to help him commit a 7-state crime spree, solidifying his place in the annals of serial infamy. Bundy was known as being handsome and charming, often charismatic to those that he met, and used these traits and talents to lure or coax most of his victims. But beyond that, and like most serial he was rather OCD and particular about whom it was that he decided to take the life of. Bundy's victims were said to have all been mostly similar, white women of mostly middle-class backgrounds between the ages of 15 and 25, many of whom were college students, and most of whom who had long straight hair with a part in the middle. But aside from this attraction to a certain kind of lady while in the living, he also liked to revisit his victims after death, often enjoying and basking in his crimes with a little dose of necrophilia. With his charms and extensive knowledge of police and forensics procedures, Bundy was able to employ a whirlwind of disgusting terror that ultimately led to his confession of 30 murders across 7 states, though most people agree that that number was actually likely higher in the end. On January the 24th of 1989, Ted Bundy would receive execution via the electric chair, though nobody was shocked at how it all came to an end. Number 7. Adolf Hitler. Likely as not, you already know that Hitler was an evil person, but here you are anyways. Adolf Hitler was the leader of Nazi Germany and the chief orchestrator of some of the worst crimes against humanity in the history of the world. He's responsible for a doctrine of hate and racially centered politics that still echoes throughout our world today, almost 100 years since he first began his insane and evil campaign. He's responsible for the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jewish people were systematically It was, in fact, an attempt to wipe them off the face of the earth. He began the aggressions of the Second World War, a conflict in which more than 40 million people would perish. As well as being a disgusting human being with some of the most evil ideas in history, Hitler was also a lazy and inept leader whose bad military ideas actually led to their defeat. Oh, and he was also famously a vegetarian, and that was a diet that apparently gave him the most explosive farts imaginable. He was actually famous for having chronic wind. Number 6. Charles Manson. For some reason, Charles Manson has captured the imagination of people for decades. He was at the center of a cult known as the Manson family, where he led members to commit a bunch of horrible in the summer of 1969. Manson had an especially criminal history. He had spent more than half his life in prison or juvenile detention of some description or another, and yes, it is possible that he was just bad to the bone. His cult would be comprised of lost or runaway young people who seemed to be able to control through a combination of ideological indoctrination and a propensity for violence, as well as the use of drugs and general coercion. Such a lovely chap.
You don't need to talk to me.
He had been slightly involved in the Los Angeles music scene, which is probably why he held a certain appeal amongst the same kind of crowd, even when he was doing all that bad stuff. His notoriety was essentially used as a symbol of the depravity, insanity, and violence that was allegedly present in pop culture. In the end, Charles Manson was convicted of first-degree and conspiracy to commit murder because although he had never directly ordered his followers to do his ideology was, in itself, overtly violent, and he controlled the minds of the people whom he led. Number 5. Joachim Kroll. Although this disgusting human is not as well known as Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, the guy was also up to some of the most heinous acts of the 20th century. Joachim Kroll was a serial killer who terrorized West Germany for 20 years before eventually being captured by authorities. He had grown up poor in Nazi Germany and then went on to live a fairly miserable existence. He was working as a farmhand when he would witness the slaughter of a pig, which is the moment that he claimed his bloodlust would become awakened. He then went on to multiple people and to cannibalize their bodies. He later claimed that he had taken parts of them to eat because meat was expensive. He was then sentenced to life in prison in 1982 and died there in 1991 of a heart attack. Number 4. Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was the dictator of the USSR from 1929 until his death in 1953. Under his authority, the Soviet Union would be transformed into a world superpower. He led the USSR throughout the Second World War and then well into the Cold War era. The thing is, though, that Stalin was not exactly a nice guy about all that transforming that he demanded. In fact, he ruled by terror, and the atrocities committed during his rule are notorious in history. His brutal reign oversaw the deaths of millions of Soviet citizens, and it's estimated that he was responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 6 million and 20 million people. Most of these were through political executions and indirectly as a result of the policies that he implemented. Most famously, this all began in the 1930s when Stalin began the so-called Great Purge, which was the first wave of executions throughout the empire that solidified the intentions of the Stalinist regime to rule by terror. This would be followed by an atrocious famine between 1932 and 1933, in which at least 4 million people would starve to death as a result of terrible decision-making in agricultural policy during that era. Number 3. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was the leader of Mongolia who established the most massive land empire in the history of the world, and he was also a little bit of a psycho. Born into a violent life, Genghis Khan's father had kidnapped his mother and then forced her into marriage. His father was poisoned by an enemy tribe before Genghis was even 10 years old. In the poverty-stricken years that would follow, Khan had a tough life, but he ultimately rose to take control of the clan and then to build an army of warriors. He removed all rivals, and by 1205, was the absolute unrivaled leader. He united the trees of the steppes and was thus the ruler over 1 million people. He changed the laws and lives of the people under his command and banned the kidnap and sale of women, banned the enslavement of the Mongols, and made the theft of livestock punishable by death. After fixing things at home, though, he then went on to conquer the world. Genghis Khan went to war against many empires in an area that included present-day Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and Uzbekistan. The Mongol armies would sweep through the cities, mostly aristocrats and soldiers, but spared the skilled workers. It's not known exactly how many people were actually during the wars of Genghis Khan, but part of the way that they were able to be so successful was because they spread terror before them and the rumors of their brutality became widespread. Number 2. Idi Amin. Idi Amin was a Ugandan general who overthrew the elected government of Uganda in 1971. Amin and his regime were one of the most brutal and violent in recent times, and after overthrowing the government of Milton Obote, Idi Amin declared himself president and set about a despotic military dictatorship that would last for 8 years. His time as president is characterized by human rights abuses, extrajudicial and ethnic persecution. Under his rule, there was a huge expulsion of Ugandan Asians. About 50,000 people would be forced to leave the country. For his enemies within, many of them were brutally tortured, illegally executed, and persecuted relentlessly. Although the actual figures are not known, on account of this being a disorganized and illegal campaign, it's estimated that somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 people were under his regime.
Africa, we have been weak because we allow ourselves.
If these numbers are not enough for you, then perhaps a few of the man's nicknames would offer you a little more insight into his character. He was also known by many monikers. Most of them were distinctly unfavorable. He was variously known as Kijambaya, which means the machete, on the account of this being the weapon of choice that his armed forces used to perpetrate that he commanded. He was also known as the Butcher of Uganda, the Butcher of Africa, the Butcher of Kampala. There's a distinct theme there in case you hadn't noticed. And there's no doubt that he was one of the worst people of the 20th century whose actions resulted in the mindless deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent people. Number 1. The Zodiac Killer. During the 1960s and 70s, a serial known as the Zodiac stalked the San Francisco area of the United States. In 1968, a young couple would be shot to death near their vehicle at a remote place just to the north of San Francisco, and then a year later, another couple was attacked in a very similar manner. On this occasion, though, the male victim survived, and following this 1969 attack, the killer telephoned the police to tell them about the crime. They also claimed responsibility for the 1968. There was one final attack in '69 in which a young couple was again shot, and once again the male survived. The Zodiac Killer is then known to have shot a taxi driver, and after these murders, the killer seemed to take great delight in taunting the newspapers, sending letters that were signed Zodiac and included codes or ciphers. The crimes seemed to stop, though there are experts who believe that the killer continued to all throughout the 80s, perhaps more than a dozen people, although this has not been proven. The identity of the Zodiac Killer remains a mystery even to this day. Since the reign of terror of the so-called Zodiac Killer, there have been multiple film, television, and written accounts and dramatizations of the events. The crimes attributed to the killer are said to be the inspiration behind the Clint Eastwood movie Dirty Harry. There's also an acclaimed film directed by David Fincher from 2007, simply called Zodiac, which tries to tell the story of these mysterious and senseless killings. Well, that was all fairly unpleasant, wasn't it? I hope you won't have too many nightmares after watching this video. Which of these terrifying people has scared you the most today? And can you even believe that such evil people exist? As always, let me know all your splendid thoughts and ideas in the comments section down below. Be sure to check out the other cool things that are showing up on the screen, and I'll see you next time.